For this lecture, we are going to discuss emotions, aggression, and stress. So emotion is a subjective mental state that is usually accompanied by distinctive behaviors as well as involuntary physiological changes. Okay? Those physiological changes are the result of activation of the autonomic nervous system. So we've described these in the past, but we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight system, right? It prepares our body for action. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which prepares the body to relax and recuperate. So let's look at some of the theories that we have that try to explain the close ties between emotions and the autonomic nervous system. So we start off with the common sense view. So that here, what's represented is that feelings trigger autonomic reaction. Okay. So on the left-hand side, the stimulus is the bang, and that then triggers the perception of danger, which triggers an emotion, which is fear. And then that fear causes the heart to race. Okay. So that fear is the trigger for the autonomic arousal. All right, let's look at James Lang theory, okay, and see how it differs. So we have the same stimulus, the bang, then we have the perception, and so there's still a perception of danger. But here, what they proposed was that the danger or the perception of danger is what was the trigger for the autonomic arousal, the heart racing. Right? And then that heart racing was the trigger for fear. Okay, so the particular emotion that is experienced, the fear, is due to that heart racing and the autonomic arousal. Okay? Whereas in the common sense, again, the fear is what triggers the autonomic arousal. Okay, then we go to the Cannon-Barr theory. So here, what this is looking at is again the same stimulus as the bang, and then the perception of danger. Okay. But what they're saying here is that it actually triggers that danger, triggers the heart racing, the autonomic arousal, as well as fear, as well as the emotion at the same time. So it is a simultaneous autonomic reaction and feeling. You don't need the heart to start racing before you feel fear. That is the idea of Cannon-Barr. Okay. And so what I did here is I put all of these together, common sense at the top, and then you have James Lang view, Cannon-Barr view, okay? And then I introduced the last one, which is the modern biopsychological view. So perception of bear, okay, causes the triggers physiological reaction, but also triggers feeling of fear. So you see those green arrows both going off to the right and to the left. Okay, so that mimics the Cannon-Barr. Okay, but then we also see that the physiological reactions cause or trigger fear. So that's the blue line. Okay, and the physiological reaction also goes back to the perception of bear, triggers the perception of bear. Okay, and then the feeling of fear also triggers physiological reactions and then also can affect the perception of bear. So in the modern biopsychological view, it's very, very reciprocal. Okay, each one of these things, perception, the feeling of fear, and the physiological reaction, the autonomic nervous system, are all interconnected. Okay, so a lot of people look at the polygraph test and they identify, is it possible for somebody to detect when an individual is lying, right? So can we objectively measure, I guess, a lie? That's what we're looking at here, okay? The polygraph test is unreliable for the most part because guilt and anxiety both can produce the same physiological responses. If you look at the chart there, you'll see the arrows in the blue, the green, the red. That's showing that during this questioning, there was some kind of a reaction, okay? So that skin conductance increased, respiration slowed down a little bit or kind of skipped a beat with the heart rate. Okay. So that would tell us, okay, so there's some kind of an emotion was triggered at that point. However, with a polygraph, we don't really know what that emotion is. So like it says here, it's unreliable because guilt and anxiety can both be viewed as the same physiological response. So if somebody is completely innocent, but they're extremely anxious, they might act in the same way as the individual who is really, really trying to mask a lie. So in the future, brain imaging scans may prove more accurate. Okay. We also come about Schachter's theory, okay, and his experiment here. So the theory itself says that emotional labels are attributed to non-specific feelings of physiological arousal. And second, which emotion we feel depends on cognitive systems that assess the context, our current social, physical, and psychological situation. So if we look at the flow diagram above, the stimulus, these were just a group of people that were put into two different groups. Okay, they were, let's say 10 people, 5 in one group, 5 in the other group. The stimulus was just to fill out a form. Okay, just a kind of a monotonous type of a task. Okay. And then they had the perception, the interpretation, the stimulus forms, okay? And then they also had an injection. So they were injected with epinephrine, okay? And so some of the people were then put into a group where they were just kind of left on their own. And then the other group was put into a group where they had an angry peer. So you see there the context. Okay. The stimulus was just them filling out the forms, but the context was, were they situated in a happy group or a content group, or were they put into an angry group? Okay. And the idea behind that was that there was a confederate, or like here they call it an angry peer, but there was a confederate, an individual who's in on the experiment, and one person was happy in group A, let's say, and the other confederate or peer was mad and angry. So what was the result? Well, the Schachter and Singer experiment showed that autonomic responses, so the injection of epinephrine, can intensify our emotions while performing normal tasks, which is the filling out the forms. Okay. And now remember here, it can intensify our emotions, but it's not saying what type of emotion. Okay. But our cognitive analysis, whether an angry or a happy confederate, affects which emotion we experience. Okay. So think about this in regard to the other things. We talked about the autonomic nervous system being triggered. Okay. So here, the injection of epinephrine, right, is triggering the autonomic nervous system to react. Okay? So that autonomic response, we know that we can kick up, we can, increase that autonomic response, but it takes a cognitive analysis, right, to affect which emotion we experience. Are we in a group? So basically with the epinephrine in a happy confederate, we're going to be more happy, right? With the epinephrine, with the autonomic response elevated, and in angry confederate, we're going to be more angry. Okay? So it's kind of like the autonomic response sets the stage, and then our cognitive analysis provides the direction of that emotion. We also look at emotions in several different ways, such as facial expressions and levels of intensity and so on. Okay. Plutchik, it says, suggests 8 basic emotions in 4 pairs of opposites. Here we have joy, sadness, affection, disgust, anger, fear, expectation, surprise. And other researchers include contempt and embarrassment in a core group of facial expressions. Okay. So I gave you a chart there of the facial expressions from anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, surprise, contempt, and embarrassment. And the idea here is that even across cultures, people see these facial expressions and they're very good at interpreting what they mean. Okay. If you see somebody with the wide eyes and open mouth, then that depicts surprise. Okay. Also, if you look at the levels of intensity, this is another way of looking at, let's say right in the middle at the very bottom, you have pensiveness. Okay. So pensiveness, that's very low level. And then medium level is sadness. But at a high intensity level, that's grief. All right. Let's look over to the left a little bit. So for a low level, you have annoyance. A medium level would be anger. And then a high level of intensity would be rage. Okay. And like I just mentioned a little bit there, cross-cultural differences. This is interesting. Cross-cultural similarity is noted in the production of expressions of specific emotions, yet some isolated groups do not agree on expressions of surprise and disgust. Okay? Subtle cultural differences suggest that cultural conditioning enforces prescribed rules for facial expression. So looking at the chart in front of you there, the percentage of agreements on the y-axis, the x-axis are the different groups. Okay, so for the Western literate individuals, very consistent there, with happiness being the highest agreement, but even with the lowest agreement of fear, it's still pretty consistent. Okay, with non-Western literate, we see that things like anger and fear and disgust are a little bit lower in that case. And then going to isolated non-literate, we see happiness is on par. So there's still the agreement on happiness is there, but it really falls off when we see something like surprise or we see disgust. Okay. So the facial feedback hypothesis suggests that sensory feedback from our facial expressions can affect our mood. People performing a task who take on a happy or sad face report stronger feelings of the emotions they were simulating. And we also see this in Botox injections, which paralyze facial muscles because it causes people to experience emotions less intensely. So there's this strong connection, your emotional centers, your limbic system, with driving the autonomic nervous system, setting you up, preparing you for your cognitive interpretation of the environment around you and what kind of emotion that you're going to feel. Okay. So, and then this even goes to with the facial feedback part with all the muscles in the face, right? So if you smile a lot, you will probably feel happier emotions. Okay. So what are some of the brain circuits that mediate these emotions? Well, brain lesions also affect emotions. We see the decorticate rage, which is a sudden intense rage in dogs whose cortex has been removed, suggesting that the cortex inhibits rage. Okay, so think about this: you have the hindbrain, the midbrain, and then the forebrain. So if the forebrain is removed from the midbrain, okay, you're going to have all of those areas of the brain, the hypothalamus with all of the drives and so on, our internal drives and stuff that we have, but nothing to stop that intensity. Okay, so we see a sudden intense rage in dogs because they don't have that frontal lobe that is controlling that. James Pepez concluded that destruction of a set of interconnected brain regions of the limbic system would impair emotional processes. And in the figure on the right-hand side, I'm showing you most of those. Okay, you have the hippocampus, amygdala, mammillary bodies, fornix, all of that, all those parts make up the limbic system. And Kluver-Bucy syndrome is characterized by dramatic reduction of fear and anxiety following bilateral amygdala damage. And you see the amygdala in that blue circle there, also part of the limbic system. Okay. Now, studies of fear conditioning. So now what we're looking at is specifically an emotion, which is fear. Okay. So it's going to be a lot about the amygdala here, located in the temporal lobe, and it appears to be a key structure in the mediation of fear. Fear-provoking stimuli reach the thalamus. So if we follow along on the figure on the left-hand side, and are directed to the amygdala via the low road, bypassing conscious processing and allowing immediate reactions to stimuli. So again, in the figure, the stimuli at the bottom, the sensory organ, whichever would that could be the eye or the ears or any of them, okay, goes to the thalamus. Thalamus is like that switching station, okay. For the low road, some of this information can actually be sent directly to the amygdala, okay. Now the high road, we bring it up to sensory cortex. So if it was the visual system, primary visual cortex, occipital lobe, etc. But the low road can go right to the amygdala. So you can see something, you can see a black widow spider, and that will send over to the low road, go to the amygdala, and you feel that fear. And it's very quick. Okay. So that's going to be very beneficial for us. Studies in humans indicate that the same circuitry is involved. Temporal lobe seizures that include the amygdala are preceded by intense fear. Okay? And effects of damage to both amygdalas cause one to not be afraid of spiders or dangerous people. They do not show startle responses, and they're only able to recognize emotions other than fear in others. So for most areas that we talk about, we talk about hippocampus and then specifically like spatial memory, right? And we think that's a really key structure. Well, here we actually see that the amygdala is a very, very key structure for fear specifically. And as far as research is showing us right now, that is the case. The cerebral hemispheres differ in emotional processing. We see that damage to the left hemisphere can lead to depressive symptoms, whereas lesions of the right hemisphere produce a cheerful attitude. And facial expressions are also asymmetrical. Composite photos of left sides of faces are judged to be more emotionally expressive than composites of right sides of faces. And what does this have to do with anything? Well, since the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, or in this case, the face, this suggests that the right hemisphere is especially important for emotional processing. Okay. And now let's focus again on a specific emotion. So we talked about fear and we talked about the amygdala. Now we're looking at the feeling of love. Feeling love can bilaterally increase activity in the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, and it decreases activity in the posterior cingulate and prefrontal cortices. And all of these areas are shown to you in both graphics on the left and right. Okay. A study comparing brain activation during sadness, happiness, anger, and fear showed activation of the insula, cingulate cortex, and prefrontal cortex. So, unlike the emotion of fear and the amygdala, where it seems to be a very, very key structure, in this case, what they've discovered is, yeah, all of these places, right? The insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, yeah, it lights up, okay, with the feeling of love. However, it also lights up with other feelings like sadness, like anger, like happiness. So there is no simple one-to-one relation between a specific emotion and changed activity of particular brain regions. Okay? Again, outside of that amygdala with the fear response. Okay, aggression. Now here we're focusing on another specific emotion, is behavior intended to cause pain or harm to others. Now, testosterone increases aggression in many species, but in humans, the relationship is less clear. Some studies show that the increased testosterone at puberty, or as administered to subjects, does not increase aggression. However, other studies show that non-aggressive behavior is correlated with low serum testosterone, okay? And then aggressive behavior in women is correlated with elevated testosterone. So we see both sides. Studies are still going out. There's still theories out there and hypotheses, created each day to look at this. Some believe it does increase aggression. Some believe it does not. Also, the last thing under other studies is that winners show higher testosterone levels than losers. Okay. So let's look at the graphic at the bottom. Castration's positive effects are likely due to reduction in sexual drive and not really in aggression. Okay. But if you look at this, castrated males, okay, and the x-axis is going to be the sessions from 0 to 33 or so, and then the y-axis are biting attacks. So with no hormone, very, very few biting attacks. When the testosterone was introduced, we see that there is an increase, and in a pretty steep increase with 150 of the milligrams a day, right? And then we go down to 75 milligrams, go down to 30 milligrams, and we see that the biting goes down. No hormone goes down pretty close to baseline, a little bit higher than baseline, but okay. So it's still up to questioning the role here, but again, it's less clear, if it is truly causing that aggression, the testosterone. Okay. Changes in levels of neurotransmitters are associated with aggression as well. The release of serotonin normally inhibits aggression. We also know that the ventromedial hypothalamus is involved in aggressive behavior. And maternal aggression, which is aggression in mothers defending their nest or offspring, is controlled by circuits in the VMH, that's the ventromedial hypothalamus, as well as the preoptic area and the premammillary nucleus. Okay, again, areas of the hypothalamus. All right. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit and we'll talk about stress. So stress includes stressful stimuli, stress processing, and stress responses. The initial response to stress is the alarm reaction. So follow along in the figure on the right. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. It is the area of the brain, right? It's the cortical area that initiates this response. Then the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. Again, that's going to be released from the pituitary gland. And these then boost heart rate, breathing, etc., in preparation for action. And then the adrenal cortex releases adrenal steroid hormones such as cortisol, which also creates this readiness, okay, for the body for action. So the figure on the right-hand side, hypothalamus, okay, to the anterior pituitary for the cortisol. And then we have the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, that blue area there, to the adrenal glands. And there's where you get the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So just think about hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, to the adrenal glands, and then to epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol. Now, all of this is a very well-orchestrated reaction. Okay, it is an alarm reaction, but it's something very healthy for the system. This gets us out of trouble, gets us out of danger. It's a reaction so that we can preserve ourselves. Okay? But as we all know, a lot of times our stress response remains for a long period of time. Okay? And that's where we see the negative effects of this increase in epinephrine, norepinephrine, and especially cortisol. So here's another example of the autonomic activation during a stress situation. Okay? Again, hypothalamus, okay, to the pituitary gland, and then we see, let's say we start with the green, the hormonal responses. So activation of the thyroid, the adrenal glands, and the testes. Parasympathetic responses are the blue lines. Okay, that's going to be facial expression there. It looks like there's heart, there's liver, okay, the intestines, bladder, and testes also. And then the sympathetic responses is going to be going to the spleen, the pancreas, heart, liver, intestines. So the body is alarming itself. It's saying it's shunting the blood away from the intestines, moving that blood towards the muscles. The heart rate increases. All of these things are kicked into high gear. But then the parasympathetic system is also trying to react, also to calm us down. Okay. Okay. So some of the negative effects of stress here we look at. Individuals differ in their responses to stress. Stress immunization is the idea that mild stress early in life makes one more resilient to later stress. And the studies that have done here is that in rats, the early stress experience was beneficial, but only if mothers comforted the pups afterward. Okay. Pups who received little maternal attention showed a greater stress response as adults due to changes in the expression of adrenal steroid receptors in the brain. Okay. So the idea here is that stress immunization, right, mild stress early in life can help prepare an individual. They've experienced it before. It's kind of like they have a learning trial. They know that they can get through this. They just have to stay strong and they'll do it. Okay, so that's a good thing. But we also know that in extreme stress, okay, severe stress in early childhood can set somebody up for long-term ailments. Okay. And if you look, oh, well, let's finish here. So the epigenetic regulation is a change in gene expression due to environmental factors. When you think of epigenetics, just think of the interaction between genes and our environment. Okay, so our environment can actually change not the genes themselves, but the expression of those genes. Okay. So dramatic evidence of epigenetic changes due to stress have been seen in humans. For example, suicide victims who had a childhood history of abuse or neglect exhibited the same epigenetic change in adrenal steroid receptor expression as seen in rats. Okay, so setting them up, okay, for a very negative type of reaction there. So again, in our figure on the right-hand side, stressors, we have social stress, we have microbes. So there's bacterias around us, there's viruses around us, there's toxins out there, and there's impaired nutrition. There's a lot of different stressors, okay? That comes in to the body's defense system, okay? And we know that this is a huge interaction. It's an interaction of endocrine factors, it's an interaction of one's genes, it's an interaction of one's immune system, okay, and one's nervous system, as well as cognitive factors, coping strategies, all those kinds of, and so that then feeds into the health consequences. An individual with a very strong immune system, very positive genetic coding there, and they have coping mechanisms, they can go through a lot of stressors and have very little of a health consequence, okay? But another individual might have some mild social stressors with a decreased immune system, poor genetic coding, poor coping skills, and it really affects them negatively in their health. So what do we do for these individuals? Okay, well, there's psychosomatic medicine, which emphasizes the role of psychological factors in disease. Health psychology is huge right now. Behavioral medicine, which emphasizes the psychological influences on health. It's not just about medication. It's also about coping strategies. It's also about cognitive behavioral therapy, being positive, your positive mental state, those kinds of things. And also psychoneuroimmunology studies, which looks at the interactions of the immune system with other organs, especially the hormonal and nervous systems. And we know that stressful periods can suppress the immune system. So looking at the effects of how one's psychology, how one's mental state can affect their immune system. Adrenal steroid hormones released during stress suppress the system, acting as a short-term defense mechanism by allowing all resources to be used for immediate survival, okay, escaping a predator. So remember what I mentioned to you with this process of the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. It's a very, very adaptive program that is good, okay, for escaping predators. And like it says, adrenal steroid hormones released during stress suppress the system, acting as a short-term defense mechanism by allowing all resources to be used. But what happens if that suppression of the system because of stress goes on for a long period of time? Now we see a depressed immune system. Okay? In the wild, animals under prolonged stress die. The stress reaction evolved as a short-term solution, not long-term. Humans are capable of experiencing stress for long periods, but this is detrimental to the immune functioning. And if we look at the table at the bottom, principal components of the stress response, right? Mobilization of energy at the cost of energy storage, but a consequence of prolonged stress would be fatigue, muscle wasting, and diabetes. Increased cardiovascular tone, on the negative side, hypertension, suppression of digestion, ulcers, suppression of growth, psychogenic dwarfism, suppression of reproduction, suppression of ovulation, suppression of immunity and of inflammatory response, impaired disease resistance, right? The decreased immune response, analgesia, pain killing, to apathy, and then finally neural responses, including altered cognition and sensory thresholds, to accelerated neurodegeneration during aging. Okay. And then we have the topic here of a specific type of stress, which a lot of people might go through, and that is bullying. So children who are bullied, either verbally or physically, are at a greater risk for mental and physical disorders later in life. Effects are as strong as those of physical or sexual abuse. So if we look at our chart on the right here, our figure, you have percentage increased risk after controlling for other variables. Bullied as a child occasionally is in blue, whereas frequently is in red. So psychological distress at age 23, much higher for the frequently bullied. Depression at age 45, again, higher for the frequently, but not as much. Anxiety disorder, completely lopsided here. Okay, for the frequently bullied, much, much higher than the occasional, and suicidality, also much higher